Hey, good morning, SJCAC, and good afternoon, New Vine family. It's so good to be with you once again. Thank you for joining us from your homes or wherever you're watching on YouTube. Wow, what a week it has been. Power outages, extreme hot weather conditions, and then of course you remember last Saturday evening and early Sunday morning, I think most of us were woken up by loud thunderstorms and a lightning show, and you know that's quite a rare occurrence here in the Bay Area, but I know that Pastor John, he slept right through it because he's so used to this stuff coming from the Midwest. But those lightning strikes, coupled with the extreme weather conditions, have really sparked hundreds of wildfires here in our state, and even started wildfires here in our immediate area. And some of you actually, I've heard, have been prepared to evacuate, and perhaps maybe at least one family that I know of maybe has already evacuated. So just know that we are praying for you. Just know that we are keeping the situation. It's ever-changing, near and dear to our hearts. But just know if you need anything, please reach out to us, and we will try to do what we can to help you. You know, it's during these uncertain times that over the last few weeks, we have been reminded of who God is. Jesus, he's our hope. He's the anchor for our souls, firm and secure, a few weeks ago from Hebrews chapter 6. And also that God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in times of trouble, just like today, and the importance of really being still before God and knowing that he is God. Psalm 46. And then last week, Pastor Ted reminded us from Hebrews chapter 12 of the importance to run the race that God has set out for you and I. And that race may look entirely different for each of us, but as we run, to get rid of anything that may hinder us from running well and from crossing the finish line. Today, I want to take a look at a book from the Old Testament, a book that's actually only 3 short chapters, a mere 56 verses in total. Now, we won't have time to read the entire 3 chapters right now, but I want to encourage you to read it over later after this service. You know, it's a book from the minor prophets called Habakkuk. Now, this is not a book like most of the other prophetic writings. It doesn't actually accuse Israel of their sin or of their wayward ways, which there were many. And it isn't a direct message to the people on God's behalf. It's actually a compilation of the prophet Habakkuk's laments, or really his expressions of loss, his complaints to God. He literally questions God's goodness because he saw so much tragedy, he saw so much oppression, so much injustice, and really wickedness in his days. He basically is saying, God, what is going on? Why are you not listening to my prayer? Now, I just wanted to go over a general, very general, high-level outline of the whole book because we don't have time to read the whole thing. His first complaint, as found in chapter 1, verses 5 through 11, actually, no, chapters 1, verses 2 to 4. Why does evil in Judah go unanswered? So he's asking God, why? How long is this going to go on? And then God's answer from verses 5 through 11, that he actually says that he will send the Babylonians, or in some versions the Chaldeans, to punish Judah. And then Habakkuk's second complaint is found in chapters 1, verse 12 to chapter 2, verse 1. And he's basically asking God, how can a just God like you use a wicked people like the Babylonians to punish people more righteous than themselves? In other words, isn't the medicine or the cure worse than the disease itself? And God's answer, his second answer, found in chapter 2, from verses 2 to 20, that Babylon eventually will be punished, but also that faith will be rewarded. And then there's a turning point in chapter 3 where it's Habakkuk's prayer, which is eventually set to song. After asking for the manifestations of God's wrath and mercy as he saw in the past, he ends with a confession of trust and joy in the Lord. Now, the way Habakkuk starts the book is quite different from the way he ends the book. In chapter 1, verses 2 to 4, Habakkuk basically asks, O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear? or cry to you violence, and you will not save? Why do you make me see iniquity? And why do you idly look at wrong? Destruction and violence are before me. Strife and contention arise. So the law is paralyzed, and justice never goes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, so justice goes forth perverted. Now at the end of chapter 3, at the very end of the book, this is how Habakkuk ends it. He says, "Yet I will rejoice in the Lord," verses 18 to 19. "I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places." Now, what happens in these 3 short chapters that turns his questioning and complaints into a song of praise and trust in the Lord? How was Habakkuk's perspective and complaints able to change in these short 3 chapters? Again, it starts off in chapter 1, verse 2. He says, "How long, O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not hear? Or cry to you violence, and you will not save?" How long, God? He's actually questioning God Almighty. He actually has the boldness and the courage to ask God, "How long, O God, are you going to stay quiet? How long are you just going to sit idly by and not do anything?" Now, to be honest, how many of us have actually asked the Lord that recently? That question of how long? I know I have. As we look at 2020, first it was the pandemic that still exists, then it was the shelter in place, then it was the death of George Floyd over the Memorial Day weekend, and all the protests over injustice, some of the police brutality, and then some of us, even our own injustices that we have experienced have surfaced. The opposing political views and the agendas as we prepare for this upcoming presidential election in a few months, and even the ways that things are being handled in terms of reopening can be quite polarizing. Schools have recently restarted, and of course they're online, they're being virtual. How long, God, is this going to take place? How long do I have to, quote unquote, supervise my kids as they go on Zoom every day? How long do you have to homeschool? And then in the last week, thunderstorms, heat waves, power outages, fires. What's next, God? How long is this going to last? When is this all going to be over? When is this craziness that we've been experiencing over the last few months going to be over? How long, God? How many of us have been questioning God, asking him, doubting? God, again, is big enough, and we've talked about this before. God is big enough for these questions, and he can take our laments, he can take our complaints to him. And some of us, again, may be thinking that perhaps questioning God is sinful, but Habakkuk did it. Job, you remember, did it. It's actually better to be honest with the Lord, with our struggles, with our feelings, with our doubts, and with our questions to him, than to let them fester and to let them breed bitterness and perhaps even anger to the Lord. God is big enough that he can take our laments, he can take our questions, he can take our anger even. Now, while an answer may not come immediately, or while God's answer may not be the one that we're expecting or perhaps that we want, God really does not condemn honest questions. So brothers and sisters, it's okay to ask the Lord how long. But we shouldn't stop there. We should wait. If we ask him the question, we should wait for his answer, and we should be prepared for the answer that he tells us. Now, the first answer that God gives to Habakkuk is found in verses 5 and 6, which reads, "Look among the nations and see, wonder and be astounded, for I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own." Now, when we're honest and when we bring God our doubts and questions, he actually might answer them. But again, it may not be the answer that we're looking for. Now, in verse 5, he reminded Habakkuk that he was working. In verse 5 it says, "For I am doing a work in your days that you would not believe if told." God, in fact, is working. Even though a lot of times we may not see him at work, we are so focused on the situation at hand. We might be so focused on our circumstance. We might be so focused on the sheltering in place. We might be so focused on the hardships that we are going through right now. When we're faced with uncertainties, we don't realize or we forget that God actually is at work. We, again, may not see it or we don't realize. We sometimes do not see the bigger picture that God sees, as we only see our current, minute situation or circumstance. But God invited Habakkuk to look and to see, to wonder and to be astounded. And even today, God is inviting us to look, to have eyes of faith, to not have our own physical eyes, but to actually stop looking from our current situation to looking above. He's saying to look at the nations, to really look beyond our limited perspective, to see the bigger picture, to gaze and to ask him, to say, God, how are you working in this situation? What bigger thing are you doing beyond my current situation? He's inviting us to wonder. He's inviting us to be amazed at what he's going to be doing. Now, I don't know how everything is going to end. I don't know when this pandemic will end or go away, and it may not go away. We may just have to live with it. And I think that's what we're realizing is we may just have to live with COVID-19 and figure out how to live with this disease or virus. But God is still working. God is doing a new thing. And over the last few weeks, you've heard testimonies of God at work in our midst. You've heard testimonies of God working in our church, of God working in healing, and God working in restoration of people to himself. You have heard some amazing things that God is doing in our midst. Wonder and see and gaze beyond our circumstance and really ask the Lord, God, what are you doing that we would not believe if we were even told? Now, I'm not going to go into Habakkuk's second complaint. It actually came because he didn't like God's response to his first complaint. Basically, Habakkuk basically said, well, I don't know why you're sending the Babylonians or the Chaldeans as an answer to Judah and to the sins of Judah, because basically they're punishing a people worse than themselves. In other words, again, isn't your cure or your solution worse than the disease itself? And again, God's answer that we'll see is eventually Babylon will be punished, but also that faith will be rewarded in chapter 2. And that's really what I want to focus on, is to skip to God's answer at the beginning of chapter 2. In chapter 2, verse 4, there is a famous phrase that most of us have heard about. It says, "But the righteous shall live by faith." Now, most of us know this phrase because it's mentioned in the New Testament 3 different times. But actually, this phrase originates from the book of Habakkuk, from God responding to Habakkuk and saying, the righteous shall live by faith. Here, God is contrasting the wicked and the righteous. And again, it's quoted 3 times. This phrase is quoted 3 times in the New Testament. In Hebrews chapter 10, verse 38. But also Paul writes about this exact phrase, the righteous shall live by faith, in Romans 1:17 and in Galatians 3:11. There is this faith component that is tied to righteous living, that is linked. It's key to us as being God's righteous people. Now, as we know, Jesus has made us righteous. We're not righteous on our own strength or ability, but it's not because of what we have done, but it's because of what Jesus has done on the cross that God is calling us righteous. But as righteous people, we are to live by faith. Now, what does that mean? Last week, I remember Pastor Ted reminding us that in Hebrews chapter 11, this famous Hall of Faith chapter, that mentioned numerous people, those that are named and even those that are unnamed, these unsung heroes of faith, as some of them, as we know of, throughout the Bible, who lived by faith, trusting in a God who is faithful, despite their current circumstances, despite the hardships, despite the persecution, despite the unknowns. These men and women of the Bible were able to put their faith in God. Brothers and sisters, let me remind you that faith, our faith in the Lord, is deeply intertwined with righteous living. We really need to ask the Lord to help us each day live by faith in him. To increase our faith, even as small as a mustard seed, even though we may not know how that faith might look like. But, he says that even if we have faith as small as a mustard seed, that he will increase it. Now, how many of us actually wake up each day and pray, Lord, grant me faith today to do what you want me to do? Or, Lord, increase my faith in this circumstance, in this situation, so that I can trust you more. How many of us really believe that as righteous people, we are to live by faith? How many of us actually are able to say, God, whatever circumstance you have put before me today, I want to come before you and ask you to increase my faith. That, Lord, you know the amount of faith that I have, but I want to ask that you will help me to live by faith as a righteous person. We are all called to be on this race together. This race requires us to have faith. This race requires us to have an unswerving trust in the Lord, not because God is going to necessarily give us roses all the time, or that our path will be rosy and honky-dory. There will be ups and downs, you know that. But in those ups and downs, how is our faith encouraged? How is our faith strengthened? How is the Lord able to give us an increase in our faith as he is there with us in that circumstance, as he is there with us in the fires, as he is there with us in the pandemic, as he is there with us in our struggles at home, as we're working from home, as we're trying to take care of our young ones and their educational needs. Chapter 3, this is where it pivots. There's something changing in Habakkuk's perspective. This is his prayer that is actually set to music at the end of the book. In chapter 3, verse 2, Habakkuk says, O Lord, I have heard the report of you, and your work, O Lord, do I fear. In the midst of the years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. That's the ESV translation. In the NIV translation, Habakkuk writes, Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds, Lord. Repeat them in our day. In our time, make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. Basically, Habakkuk is saying, God, I have heard of your miracles. I have heard from the ancestors of your fame, how you have brought our ancestors of Israel out of the land of Egypt, how you parted the Red Sea, how you brought us into the promised land. I have heard of your fame. I know of your deeds, and I stand in awe of your deeds. Brothers and sisters, Habakkuk is able to remember the Lord's works and to recount and to remember what God has done in not only his own life, but in his family, in his ancestors. And today, one of the ways to live a life of faith is to recount what God has done in your life and in mine. What has the Lord brought you out of? What part of slavery, what part of Egypt has God brought you out of? What entrapment, what entanglement has God freed you from? How has the Lord been faithful? How has he been a faithful father to you? How has he been faithful in your school, in your education, in your career, in your family? How has the Lord been faithful to you? Recount those deeds of the Lord. Remember and retell of what God has done in your specific life. Remember, and perhaps you need to reread perhaps an old journal from 5 or 10 years ago. Perhaps you wrote down of God's amazing work, and perhaps you needed to be reminded today of God's faithfulness in your life, and to really be standing in awe of God's deeds, not just to be standing in awe of his awesomeness and of his mighty creation, but to be standing in awe of what God has done in your life. Perhaps there was a time in your life where God brought you out of a pit of despair. Perhaps there was a moment in your life that you felt like you amounted to nothing, and that God used something to remind you of your worth in him. Perhaps there was a situation in your schooling that you were that you failed, that you felt utterly in despair. But somehow God was able to be faithful and to remind you of who you are as a child of his. And somehow God turned that situation around. God is faithful, that God basically got you out of school, got you through school, and has since provided you with an awesome career. Remembering and recounting God's goodness and God's faithfulness in your life is one of the ways to really see what God has done, but also to anticipate what God is going to do. If God was so faithful to you and I in the past, will he not so much more be faithful to you and I today and tomorrow and throughout eternity? I want to fast forward a little bit towards the end of Habakkuk, chapter 3. Verses 17 through 19, Habakkuk basically says, this is really pretty. I don't know if you've noticed this in the past, but it says, though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. Now, clearly, this is quite amazing. This is quite an amazing statement or statements that Habakkuk is able to say. Even though everything is non-existent, even though there's no harvest, there's no fruit, even though there's no olive harvest, there's no food, even though there is no cattle, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. Brothers and sisters, Habakkuk made a choice to rejoice even though there was still lack, a choice to rejoice even though there was still want, a choice to rejoice even though his immediate needs may have not been met. Choosing to rejoice and taking joy in the God of his salvation. Now, I know that's quite a tall order. I know it's not easy. But Habakkuk was able to do that because he was reminded of what God had done in the past. He knew of God's faithfulness. He knew that God loved him and his people. He knew that God would continue to be faithful. Now, it didn't say that this actually happened. It just says that though these things may happen, he still chose to rejoice. You know, it's a choice to rejoice. It's a choice to be in the pit. It's a choice to be bitter. But brothers and sisters, may I encourage you to choose joy today. May I encourage you to take joy in the God of our salvation. The last verse is something that I kind of want to spend a few moments on. In verse 19, Habakkuk says, God, the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. Now, I'm going to take a pause and I'm going to share with you just a story that we had a couple weeks ago. Some of you may know that Cheryl and I and the family, we were in Yosemite just last week. And, you know, we took our 3 kids, and then we also took my mom and my aunt. We took a few hikes. Very easy hikes. One day we went and we drove into up to Glacier Point, and then we went to Sentinel Dome, and we chose the hike to Sentinel Dome. It wasn't that strenuous of a hike, but actually when you get up to the dome, it's 8,100 feet, and you know it's a short hike, but the final stretch is quite steep onto actually the dome itself, which is granite rock. And you know we left my mom and my aunt because they're in their 80s. A little before the dome itself, and we just told them to rest in the shade. But then Cheryl and I, along with our 3 little ones, ages 4, 6, and 8, we walked up this dome. And to be quite honest, I wasn't quite sure how Enoch, our youngest one, would do. He's only 4. Josiah kind of led the way. He's 8, so he kind of, I guess a little fearless, but he kind of climbed over the rocks, and you know, Cheryl held on to Esther, I held on to Enoch. But it was a little strenuous for the little guy, but he made it. But it was really interesting because, you know, I don't know I'm sure some of you have climbed that dome, and you're probably thinking, oh, it's not that big of a deal. But actually, it was a little scary, having the little ones run off a bit, because it was, quite high. And when we were getting closer and closer to the top, we actually grabbed onto their hands quite hard. I was a little afraid because, if you look down, it's actually quite high, obviously. But the thing is, we were climbing through the rocks, and there was really no set trail per se once you get onto the granite. It's just kind of like, you climb the rocks and you just kind of figure out your way. And the little guys did that too, and it was great. But once we got up there, it was a fabulous, phenomenal view. 360 degrees all around, just looking at Half Dome, looking at the valley below, looking at some of the waterfalls, just spectacular. 360 all the way around, a different view from each angle. Phenomenal. Now, the reason I bring this example up is because in this verse of verse 19, it says, God the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. And some of you, I don't know how much you know about deer or gazelles or their anatomical makeup, but the hooves of the deers actually is quite spectacular. Now, I was reading that these sure-footed animals, they can climb rocky cliffs and never stumble or fall, and even quite steep cliffs. And in climbing, the deer actually can place her back feet exactly where her front feet were. And really only needing 2 sturdy footrests instead of 4. And it's quite phenomenal how the Lord has really designed the deer to climb these rocks, to climb these hills. And I share the Yosemite story with you because I kind of felt like, oh, if only we had the feet of the deer to kind of maneuver and climb up those rocks, it would have been so much easier and pain-free. But the deer can basically scamper across what appears to be a difficult vertical cliff, totally unafraid, totally undeterred by seemingly impassable terrain. Now, Habakkuk is likening that the Lord is making his feet like the deer's. Now, brothers and sisters, if we have the feet of these deer, God is able to allow us to go to these high places. God is able to allow us to tread on these heights. We can live above our circumstance. We can live above each challenging rock that is set before us. We can live, beyond the scariness, because some of the rocks may be unsturdy. And when we climbed up Sentinel Dome, some of the rocks, in fact, were unsturdy. But if we have the feet like these deer that Habakkuk is talking about, the Lord is our strength. The Lord is the one holding on to our feet, helping us stay strong, helping us be anchored into Him, helping us to tread on these high places, helping us to climb so that when we get to the top, we can gaze around and see the beauty. We can see the bigger picture, the grander Yosemite Valley. We can see beyond our current circumstance and really see from God's perspective. God gives us the grace, the courage, the hope, and the inner strength that we need to press on to attain new heights and to experience that fabulous view from the top, from the dome. And with the swiftness of a deer, we can escape the enemies and we can gain freedom. We can escape the fears because God is with us, because the sovereign Lord is our strength. Now, even as we close today, I just really want to pause and your exact situation. Your exact circumstance. And some of you might be really enjoying this season, and that's great. Praise God, you're doing well. But I know for a lot of us, again, it has been hard. And I know it's hit home for many of us. Questions about how long? Questions about, God, where are you? Questions about, God, I know you're faithful, but sometimes I don't see you at work. But I hope that through this short book of Habakkuk, that God is reminding you today that no, God is still at work. He's actually working behind the scenes. Perhaps you and I don't see it right now, but He's working among the nations. He's doing a bigger thing. And we need to ask him for those eyes of faith. We need to ask him to say, God, give me that faith to believe, to trust that you are in fact working. And that we need to be reminded of what God has already done in our lives. And that God will continue to be faithful, that God will continue to be true. And that we need to say, I'm going to choose joy. I'm going to choose to have the joy of the Lord to be my strength. Now, I may not feel like joy every day, but I'm going to ask and say, God, grant me your joy, that your joy would carry me through, that your joy would be my strength to get me through. And lastly, that we would desire to have the feet that God is promising, the feet of the deer, so that we can be strengthened, so that we can climb these mountains, so that we can climb each rock, each boulder, so that the Lord would enable us to get to that height, to enable us to see beyond, to see the bigger thing that God is doing, to gaze upon his beauty and the beauty that God is creating in your life and mine. Brothers and sisters, we need to have these feet of the deer so that we can be light in our steps, so that we can not have fear, so that we can trample on the rocks and really know that the Lord is our strength. So be blessed with what we have gone over today from the book of Habakkuk, knowing that God is with us, knowing that God is our strength.